My son-in-law stood in my living room, the one my husband and I built our lives in, and he pointed at me with his glass of whiskey. He said it loud enough for everyone to hear. For my friends. For my neighbors. "Oh, Beatrice," he laughed. "Just let her stay in the corner, nobody cares." He wanted me to feel like a ghost in my own home on Christmas Day. He thought I was just a frail old woman who should be grateful for a seat by the fire. But his cruelty was a mistake. It was a mistake that would end up costing him everything he was secretly planning to take from me. Because that one sentence led to a whispered secret from my granddaughter. A secret that exposed his entire disgusting plot. He thought he was clever, but he had no idea that I was the one who held the power to destroy his future. And just before I tell you the words I overheard that changed everything, I'd love to know where you're watching from today. It gives me strength to know I'm not alone. Please, take a moment and write your city in the comments below. The air in my home on Christmas Eve always tasted sweet. It was a flavor I spent all of December creating, a careful blend of fresh pine from the wreath on the door, cinnamon from the cider simmering on the stove, and the rich warm scent of the sugar cookies I baked using my mother's recipe. This house, for me, was not just wood and plaster. It was a living thing, a keeper of memories. Every ornament on the tree told a story. The fragile glass bird my husband, Robert, bought for our first Christmas together. The lopsided clay star our daughter, Nora, made in kindergarten. I ran my hand over the fine dust of flour on my apron and smiled. Everything was ready. The fire was crackling, casting a warm, dancing light across the living room. The presents were wrapped. The table was set with the good china, the one we only used for holidays. My heart felt full of a quiet, hopeful anticipation. This was the one night of the year I allowed myself to believe that everything could be perfect, that the small fractures in our family could be healed by the warmth of tradition. Then, through the frosted glass of the front window, I saw the headlights of a car slice through the early evening darkness. They were here. I smoothed my hair, took a deep breath to settle the flutter in my chest, and opened the door just as they were stepping onto the porch. Snowflakes clung to their coats. My granddaughter, Lily, saw me first. Her face lit up, like the angel on top of my tree. "Grandma!" she squealed, running past her parents and burying her face in my waist. I hugged her tight, breathing in the cold, fresh scent of her hair. For that one moment, everything was perfect. "Merry Christmas, my sweet girl," I whispered. Then Mark, my son-in-law, stepped inside, followed by Nora. He stomped the snow from his expensive leather boots onto the welcome mat I had laid out just an hour before. He looked around the room, his eyes scanning everything, not with warmth, but with appraisal. Like a man inspecting a property, not a home filled with love. "Still rocking the 1980s Christmas look, I see," he said. It was not a joke. It was a judgment. It landed in the warm room with a cold thud. I felt the familiar little sting, the tightening in my chest. I had spent days carefully placing each of those decorations, each a piece of our family's history. To him, it was just old, outdated. I glanced at Nora. She gave me that look I knew so well. A weak, apologetic smile that did not apologize for his rudeness, but instead pleaded with me not to make a scene. A smile that said, "Please, Mom, just let it go." And so, as I had done 1,000 times before, I did. "Well, some things are too precious to change," I said, keeping my voice light. I turned to help Nora with her coat. Mark was already walking into the living room, leaving his own coat on. He picked up one of Robert's old military service medals I kept displayed on the mantelpiece, turning it over in his hand with a bored expression before putting it down with a careless clink. Nora handed me a brightly colored gift bag. "We brought dessert, Mom. A tiramisu from that new Italian bakery downtown." "Oh, that's lovely, dear," I said, and I meant to sound grateful, but my heart sank a little. In the kitchen, cooling on the rack, was the apple pie I had made from scratch, the one she had always called her favorite. It was another small signal, another message, that my efforts were no longer needed, that they could be easily replaced by something new and store-bought. I took their coats, the fabric cold against my arms, and hung them carefully in the closet. When I returned, Mark was on his phone, his thumb scrolling quickly. Lily was the only one who seemed to see the magic in the room. She was carefully touching the tinsel on the lowest branch of the tree. "Grandma, did Grandpa Robert really buy this bird?" she asked, pointing at the fragile glass ornament. I smiled, a real smile this time. "He certainly did. It was our very first Christmas as husband and wife. He told me it was a symbol of our new life taking flight." "Wow," Lily whispered, her eyes wide. "It's a $20 piece of glass, Lily," Mark said without looking up from his phone. "Don't break it." The magic vanished. The story died. I saw the light go out of Lily's eyes, and she quickly pulled her hand back. I wanted to say something. I wanted to tell him that its value had nothing to do with money. That some things, the most important things, could not be bought or sold. But I saw Nora's warning glance. I saw the rigid set of Mark's shoulders, and I knew that any word from me would be seen as an attack, as me being difficult or overly sensitive. So I swallowed the words and turned towards the kitchen. "Who wants some hot cider?" I asked, my voice sounding cheerful, a perfect imitation of a woman who was not feeling her heart slowly being chipped away. I set the table, placing their names at the settings I had so carefully prepared, not knowing that by the end of the night, I wouldn't even feel like I had a place at my own table. We sat at the dining room table, the one Robert had sanded and refinished himself the year Nora was born. The candlelight flickered across our faces, creating the illusion of warmth and intimacy. For a few moments, with the quiet clinking of forks against china, I could almost pretend we were the happy family from a Christmas card. I asked Nora about her work, and she gave vague, tired answers. I asked Lily about her friends at school, and she chattered excitedly about the upcoming holiday pageant. But the peace was fragile, and Mark was never one for quiet conversation. He cleared his throat, pushing his half-eaten plate of food away as if to signal that the pleasantries were over. "Had a meeting with the zoning board last week," he announced to the table, though his words were clearly meant for me. "It's unbelievable what they make you go through to get a simple variance. I've got this prime lot over on the west side, but it's a quarter-acre shy of being subdividable. An absolute gold mine, just sitting there." I nodded politely, taking a sip of water. I knew this was not just a story about his work. With Mark, it was never just a story. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes sweeping over the floral wallpaper in my dining room. "You know, the real money, the smart money, is in legacy. Properties. Places like this." He gestured vaguely around the room. "Double lot, mature trees, historic neighborhood. You can't buy that. But these old houses, the upkeep is a nightmare. The value isn't in the drafty windows and old plumbing. It's in the land." A chill went through me that had nothing to do with the winter air outside. He was not talking about real estate. He was talking about my home. He was sitting at my table, eating the food I had cooked, and telling me that my life, my memories, my sanctuary, was nothing more than an obstacle sitting on a valuable piece of dirt. Nora must have felt it too. She nervously placed her fork down. "Mark, maybe we can talk about work later." "Mom, this roast is just wonderful. Is that rosemary I taste?" It was a clumsy attempt to change the subject, and Mark swatted it away with a wave of his hand. "It's a simple fact, Nora. People get sentimental about old houses and lose sight of the bigger picture. Imagine what a modern, energy-efficient duplex could go for on a lot this size. You'd be set for life. No more worrying about leaky roofs or property taxes." He looked directly at me then, a predatory gleam in his eye. "It's just something to think about." The message was clear. Your time here is ending. Your home is an asset waiting to be liquidated. I felt like a bug under a microscope, being examined for my worth. I looked at my daughter, hoping for an ally, a defender. But she just stared down at her plate. Her silence my answer. She would not stand up to him. She would not stand up for me. Later, we moved to the living room to open presents. The fire had been stoked and the room was warm, but I felt a cold knot of dread in my stomach. Lily opened her gifts with pure, infectious joy, making the rest of us smile. When it was my turn, I handed a soft, rectangular package to Mark. "This is for you. I hope you like it," I said. He tore the paper off with an indifference that felt like a small act of violence. Inside was a scarf, knitted from a soft, charcoal gray merino wool. I had spent nearly a month working on it, the complex cable knit pattern a challenge for my aging fingers. I had pictured him wearing it on cold winter mornings. It was a gift not of money, but of time, of thought, of affection. He held it up for a moment. "Huh, a scarf?" he said. His smile was thin, a mere stretching of the lips. "Thanks, Beatrice. Very nice." He then folded it, or rather crumpled it into a loose bundle and placed it on the end table next to his chair. He never looked at it again. A moment later, Nora handed him a small, sleek box, and his entire face lit up as he pulled out a new, expensive smartwatch. My hand-knitted gift was forgotten, an insignificant lump of yarn cast aside in favor of something new and shiny. I watched him tap at the screen of his new watch, his face animated with a genuine excitement he had not shown all night. And I understood. To him, things were only valuable if they had a price tag. My time, my effort, my love, they were worthless. They could not be quantified or sold. As more guests arrived, friends and neighbors dropping in for a glass of eggnog, the rooms filled with cheerful noise. Laughter and Christmas carols echoed off the walls. But the louder the house became, the more silent I grew. I felt myself becoming smaller, quieter, a part of the old furniture he so clearly despised. I was preparing to fade into the background for the rest of the evening, not realizing that Mark had one more Christmas gift for me, a public humiliation I would never forget. The living room was buzzing with a life that felt entirely separate from me. My neighbors, the Potters, were laughing with Nora by the fireplace. A few of Mark's business acquaintances were gathered around him, hanging on his every word as he pontificated about the market. I remained in my armchair, the one Robert always used to sit in, nestled in a corner of the room. It had always been my favorite spot for watching the family, but tonight, I felt less like a matriarch and more like a spectator watching a play I was no longer a part of. I held my lukewarm cup of tea in my hands, its warmth a small, fading comfort. I was content to be invisible. In fact, I preferred it. The small talk was exhausting, and the effort of smiling while my heart felt bruised was becoming too much. I watched Lily showing her new doll to Mrs. Potter, and I felt a pang of love so sharp it almost hurt. She was the one pure, uncomplicated joy in my life. Mark's voice, lubricated by his second glass of whiskey, cut through the cheerful din. He was talking to a man named Henderson, a developer with a slick smile and hungry eyes. I had seen men like him circle properties for years when I worked at the county office. They saw land, not homes. Henderson gestured vaguely in my direction with his glass. "Your mother-in-law is a quiet one, isn't she?" he asked, his tone laced with a dismissive sort of charm. I saw the smirk spread across Mark's face. It was the look of a predator who had just been given the perfect opportunity to pounce. He took a theatrical sip of his drink, drawing the attention of the small group around him. "Oh, Beatrice?" he said, his voice loud enough to carry across the room, loud enough to make a few conversations falter. "Just let her stay in the corner. Nobody cares." He chuckled, a short, ugly sound. "She's happy as long as she has her tea." The words hit me with physical force. It was not just the insult, but the public nature of it. The way he had so casually erased me in front of everyone. I saw Henderson let out an uncomfortable laugh. I saw Mrs. Potter's smile freeze on her face as she glanced over at me with pity in her eyes. Pity. It was worse than the insult itself. In my own home, on Christmas Day, I had been turned into an object of pity. The blood rushed to my cheeks, a hot tide of shame. I wanted to disappear. I wanted the floral pattern of the armchair to swallow me whole. My world seemed to shrink down to the teacup in my trembling hands. But then, a small body crashed into my legs. It was Lily. She wrapped her arms around me, her cheek pressed against my knee. She had heard him. In her innocent world, she may not have understood the nuance of his cruelty, but she had understood the tone. She had sensed the attack. She looked up at me, her brow furrowed with a child's serious concern. "Don't be sad, Grandma," she whispered, her voice a tiny thread in the sudden quiet. She leaned in closer, her breath warm against my ear, and her next words shattered my world completely. "Daddy told Mommy he found something called a legal loophole to make you move to that apartment place soon." Time stopped. Legal loophole, apartment place. The casual cruelty of Mark's comment suddenly clicked into place with the chilling precision of a key turning in a lock. It was not just disrespect, it was a strategy. The comments. About my house being old, about the value being in the land. Nora bringing a store-bought dessert as if my own traditions no longer mattered. They were not just thoughtless jabs. They were part of a campaign to make me feel small, irrelevant, and powerless. A campaign to prepare the ground for what came next, removing me from my home. Everything came into focus. The insults, the comments about my house. It was all part of a plan, and in that moment, I knew I had a choice to make. Before I tell you what I decided to do that very night, if you believe that a person's dignity is something worth fighting for, please take a moment to subscribe to this channel. Knowing you're with me on this journey gives me more strength than you can imagine. I hugged Lily back, my arms a little too tight. "Thank you for the hug, my sweet girl," I managed to say, my voice sounding distant and strange to my own ears. I looked over her head and my eyes met Mark's across the room. He was already back to his conversation, laughing about something else. He had forgotten his comment, forgotten me. He had no idea he had just handed me the one thing I needed most. The cold, hard, undeniable truth. The rest of the party passed in a blur. I was a ghost at my own feast. I smiled. I refilled glasses. I thanked people for their lovely gifts. I played the part of the happy hostess. But inside, a revolution was taking place. The hurt was still there, a deep, aching wound. But something else was growing alongside it. A cold, quiet anger that felt less like a raging fire, and more like the slow, unstoppable force of a glacier. It was an anger that clarified, that focused, that sharpened my mind. Patience had been my shield for years. I had endured the small cuts, the dismissive remarks, all for the sake of a fragile peace. But I saw now that I had not been keeping the peace. I had only been delaying a war that had already been declared on me. When the last guest had finally gone, and Nora and Mark were getting their coats, Nora came to me and gave me a perfunctory hug. "It was a lovely evening, Mom," she said. Mark just nodded from the doorway, jingling his car keys. They had no idea. They saw the same woman they had seen for years. A quiet, accommodating, predictable old woman. The party was over, and the silence in the house was deafening. But for the first time all night, my mind was perfectly clear. They had made one critical mistake. They had shown me their entire hand, and now it was my turn to play. After the door clicked shut behind them, a profound silence descended upon the house. It was a heavy, suffocating quiet, broken only by the tired sigh of the fire slowly dying in the hearth. I stood motionless in the center of the living room, surrounded by the ghosts of the party. A crumpled piece of wrapping paper here, a wine glass half full there. The festive decorations that had brought me so much joy just hours before now seemed to mock me, their cheerful colors a stark contrast to the cold grayness that was blooming inside my chest. I did not cry. The pain was too deep, too precise for tears. Tears felt like a surrender, and I had been surrendering for years. This feeling was different. It was a cold, sharp clarity, the kind that comes after a high fever breaks. For the first time, I saw my family not as I wished they were, but as they truly were. Mark was not just arrogant. He was a predator. And Nora, my sweet Nora, was not just conflict avoidant. She was his willing accomplice. Her silence was not a sign of weakness. It was a choice. She had chosen her husband's greed over her mother's dignity. That was a truth that cut deeper than any of Mark's insults. I walked slowly through the downstairs rooms, my hand trailing along the back of the sofa, over the polished surface of the dining table. I was not cleaning. I was taking inventory, not of my possessions, but of my life. Every object held a memory, a piece of the story Robert and I had built together. The worn spot on the arm of his favorite chair, the small scratch on the floor where Nora had fallen off her tricycle. This house was not a collection of things. It was the bedrock of my entire existence, and they were planning to take a bulldozer to it. My steps led me to the mantelpiece. I picked up the framed photograph of Robert, taken the year before he passed. He was in his army uniform, his smile so full of life, his eyes so kind. I looked at his face, and I did not feel weak. I did not feel the urge to ask him for help. I felt a surge of his own strength, a stubborn resilience that I had perhaps let go dormant for too long. He had fought for his country. He had fought for his family. He had built this life for us with his own 2 hands. And I, Beatrice Vance, his wife, was not going to let a greedy, small-minded man tear it all down. I was not going to let his legacy be measured in square footage and sold to the highest bidder. In that quiet moment, standing before the photograph of the man I loved, I made a decision. It was not a loud, dramatic vow. It was a silent, internal click, like a lock settling firmly into place. The door to my patience, to my endless understanding, to my willingness to absorb their casual cruelty, was now closed and bolted. I would no longer be a line item in their financial plans. I would no longer be a ghost in my own home. My generosity had been mistaken for weakness, and that was a mistake I was now going to correct. The transformation was not sudden. It was a slow cooling, a process of grief turning into granite. The part of me that had spent years hoping, praying that Nora would see the truth, that Mark would soften, that part of me quietly died that Christmas night. And in its place, something new began to grow. It was a cold resolve, a focus so intense it felt like I could see the path forward with perfect clarity. I was not a victim. A victim is someone who has no power, and I was beginning to remember the power I had. It was not the kind of power Mark understood. It was not about money or influence. It was quieter, deeper. It was the power of knowledge. Mark saw a house and a double lot. He saw a project, a profit margin. Nora saw an obligation, a burden from the past. They had both forgotten what this property really was. They had forgotten its history, a history I knew better than anyone, a history that was recorded not just in my heart, but in ink and paper, in ledgers and maps, tucked away in the county archives where I had spent 4 decades of my life. They had forgotten who I was. I was the woman who knew where every single document was filed. That night, I did not sleep. I went into Robert's old study, the one room I had kept exactly as he left it. I closed the door, shutting out the sad, drooping Christmas decorations. I sat in his big leather chair until the first pale light of dawn crept through the windows, not with a broken heart, but with a blueprint forming in my mind. They thought they knew this property's value. I was about to teach them a lesson in history, a subject in which I was the undisputed expert. The day after Christmas, the house was a disaster, a silent testament to the previous night's ugly festivities. But for the first time in years, I did not feel the compulsive need to tidy up, to restore order. The mess outside did not matter, because a new kind of order was taking root inside me. I bypassed the kitchen with its stack of dirty dishes and went straight to Robert's study. The room smelled of old books, leather, and his faint, lingering scent of pipe tobacco. It was a room of logic, of history, of quiet contemplation. It was the perfect place to plan a war. I unlocked the large, metal flat-file cabinet in the corner, a piece of furniture I had brought home upon my retirement. The wide, shallow drawers slid open with a heavy, satisfying groan. Inside, protected by sheets of archival paper, were the historical maps of Maple Creek County. They were my secret passion, a collection I had amassed over 40 years. To anyone else, they were just old paper. To me, they were a roadmap to the past. I carefully unrolled the 1888 plat map of our district. The paper was brittle, the ink faded, but the lines were clear. My house was there, a simple square, but the property lines were drawn differently than they were today. I spent the next several hours cross-referencing my modern deed with the historical maps, my fingers tracing the ghosts of old fences and forgotten roads. My home was not an island. It was connected to a web of history, of agreements and rights of way made by people long dead. I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that my answer was in that web. But my home collection could only take me so far. To build an ironclad case, I needed the official records, the ledgers that were the ultimate source of truth. The next morning, I put on my most professional wool coat, the one I used to wear to town meetings, and drove to the Maple Creek County Hall of Records. Walking through those doors felt like coming home. The familiar scent of old paper and binding glue, the quiet hum of the microfilm readers, the deferential nods from the county employees. Here, I was not Beatrice, the quiet old woman in the corner. I was Mrs. Vance, the woman who had run this department with an expert hand for decades. A young clerk, a woman I had hired just before I retired, looked up from her desk and her eyes widened in recognition. "Mrs. Vance, it is so good to see you. Are you here for a visit?" "Something like that, Maria," I said, giving her a warm smile. "I need to access the pre-1900 deed and easement ledgers for the Elm Street district, and the corresponding tax maps." She blinked, surprised by the specificity of my request. "Of course. Anything you need. You know where everything is better than I do." She was right. I did. For the next 3 days, I became a fixture in the archives. I pulled the heavy, leather-bound ledgers from the shelves myself, the weight of them familiar and comforting in my arms. I sat for hours, my back straight, turning the thick, fragile pages one by one. My eyesight was not what it used to be, but I knew what to look for. I scanned the elegant, looping cursive of my long-dead predecessors, searching for a name, a phrase, a notation that would have been invisible to a casual observer. I was hunting for an encumbrance, a legal restriction on my property that a modern title search, the kind Mark's lawyers would perform, would likely miss. Something old, something forgotten, but something still legally binding. I searched through land grants, utility agreements, and property line disputes. With each dead end, my resolve only hardened. I knew it was there. History always leaves a paper trail. On the afternoon of the third day, I found it. It was not a dramatic discovery. Highlighted in red ink, it was a single, unassuming entry in a ledger from 1888. The entry detailed a property line adjustment between my great-grandfather and the town of Maple Creek. In exchange for the town ceding a small, unusable parcel of land to him, my great-grandfather had granted the town, in perpetuity, a public passage easement. It was a 10-foot-wide path along the northern edge of my property, created for the sole purpose of allowing citizens to access the town woods for recreation. My heart began to beat faster. I read the entry again, my finger tracing the handwritten words. The language was archaic, but legally precise. And most importantly, I could find no subsequent record of the easement ever being legally extinguished or abandoned. It had simply been forgotten. The woods had become less popular for recreation. New access roads were built elsewhere, and over a century, the public path had faded back into a simple property line that everyone, including my own family, assumed was private. This was it. This was the key. Mark's plan to subdivide, to build, to bulldoze my backyard, all of it depended on him having complete and unrestricted control over the entire property. This forgotten easement shattered that possibility. I felt a slow, triumphant smile spread across my face. I walked calmly over to the registrar's desk. "Maria," I said, my voice steady, "I need you to make me 3 certified copies of page 112 of Ledger C from 1888. Walking out of the archives and into the cold winter air, I clutched my briefcase, the certified copies safely inside. I felt no anger, only a cold, exhilarating purpose. Mark had been searching for a loophole to get me out of my house. I had just found one to preserve it, and its history, forever. Now, it was time to put my plan into motion. My plan was not to build a wall, but to open a gate. Mark's power came from his ability to isolate me, to make me feel small and alone. My power, I realized, would come from the exact opposite. It would come from community, from history, and from a public act of generosity so sincere that he would be powerless to fight it. My first calls the next morning were not to a lawyer, but to two people I knew would understand the language of legacy better than anyone. The first was Eleanor Gable, the formidable white-haired president of the Maple Creek Historical Society. The second was a young, earnest man named Ben Davies, a rising star on the Town Conservation Commission. I invited them both to my home for tea. They arrived together on a bright, cold afternoon. I served them tea and my mother's sugar cookies at the dining room table, the very table where Mark had laid out his vision of my home's destruction. But today, the room felt different. It was not a place of conflict, but a place of purpose. I was in command. After a few minutes of pleasantries, I got straight to the point. "Eleanor, Ben," I began, my voice calm and measured, "I've asked you here today because I have made a discovery regarding my property that I believe will be of significant interest to both the Historical Society and the Conservation Commission." I saw a flicker of polite, professional interest in their eyes. They likely expected a story about an old bottle found in a wall or a question about tree preservation. They were not expecting what came next. I laid out the 3 certified copies of the 1888 ledger page on the polished wood of the table. I explained my professional background as county registrar, which immediately shifted the dynamic. I was not just a sentimental homeowner. I was an expert in this field. With the precision of a scholar, I walked them through the language of the public passage easement, explaining its legal standing and how it had been left dormant for over a century. I watched their faces as they leaned in to read the document. Eleanor's eyes, magnified by her reading glasses, widened with delight. "Beatrice, this is extraordinary. A 19th century public right-of-way, completely documented. This is a significant historical find." Ben Davies was equally intrigued, but for different reasons. "This easement directly abuts the town woods," he said, his mind clearly working on the practical implications. "A public access point from Elm Street would be a huge asset. We have been trying to create more trail connectivity for years." This was the moment. I had laid the groundwork. Now I would present my vision. I'm glad you both see the potential," I said, "because this discovery has inspired me. My family has lived on this land for 5 generations. This town has been very good to us. I have been thinking a great deal lately about legacy, about what we leave behind." I paused, letting the weight of my words settle in the quiet room. "Therefore, it is my intention to formally and legally honor this historical easement. More than that, I wish to donate the 10-foot wide parcel of land, in its entirety, to the town of Maple Creek. I want to work with you both to create a permanent, protected public footpath. We could call it the Vance Family Heritage Trail." The silence that followed was broken by Eleanor Gable, letting out a short, delighted laugh. "Beatrice Vance, that is the most wonderfully generous and clever idea I have heard in all my years with the Society." Ben was already nodding enthusiastically. "A heritage trail. Mrs. Vance, this is a phenomenal gift to the community. It's a win for historical preservation and a win for conservation. The Commission would absolutely support this. We could help with trail markers, maintenance." As they left my home an hour later, buzzing with excitement and clutching copies of my research, I felt a sense of peace I had not felt since before Robert died. My plan was now in the hands of the town itself. It was a good reminder that sometimes the best way to protect yourself is to create something positive for everyone. If this story is inspiring you to find your own strength, please take a moment to press the like button below. It helps these stories reach others who might need to hear them, and it shows me that you are here with me. The next 2 weeks were a flurry of quiet, purposeful activity. Guided by my expertise, the town moved with surprising speed. I met with the town surveyor to mark the exact path of the trail. I signed the official deed of donation in the town clerk's office, my hand steady as I wrote my name. With each step, I was weaving a web of legal protection around my home, a web made of public goodwill and ironclad bureaucracy. My enemies would not be a person they could bully, but the full weight of the Maple Creek Town Council. The final document was stamped and filed. It was done. The Vance family heritage trail was now a permanent, official, and irreversible part of Maple Creek. All that was left was for the official public notice to be printed and mailed, as required by law, to all adjacent property owners, a category which, as the owners of the home next door, included my daughter and my son-in-law. I pictured the crisp, white envelope arriving in the mailbox of their perfect suburban home. I had not fired a single shot, but I knew with absolute certainty that a storm was about to break. For 3 days, a quiet peace settled over my home. I used the time to tidy up, but this time it was not a chore. It was a reclaiming of my space. I packed away the Christmas decorations, not with sadness, but with a sense of finality. The holiday, and the woman I had been during it, were now in the past. I felt a calm resolve settle into my bones. I was not anxious. I was simply waiting. I knew the letter from the town council would take a day or two to arrive at their house. I knew the explosion was coming. I was merely watching the sky, waiting for the inevitable storm to break. It came on a Thursday afternoon. The phone rang, its shrill sound cutting through the quiet house. I looked at the caller ID. It was Nora. I let it ring one more time, took a slow, steadying breath, and then answered, my voice even and calm. "Hello, dear." For a moment, there was only a choked, sputtering sound on the other end. Then, in the background, I heard Mark's voice, a furious, muffled roar. He was shouting, but I could not make out the words, only the raw, animal rage in his tone. Then Nora's voice came on the line, thin and trembling with a mixture of tears and fury. "Mom, what did you do? What did you do?" she cried, her voice escalating into a wail. "We got a letter from the town. A trail? A heritage trail? What were you thinking? Are you losing your mind?" The accusation was exactly what I expected. It was their first line of attack, to frame me as confused, senile, incompetent, a confused old woman who had made a terrible mistake that they, the sensible adults, would have to come and fix. "I am perfectly fine, Nora," I said, my voice as placid as a calm lake. I knew exactly what I was doing. "No, you don't," she shrieked, and I could hear Mark shouting again in the background, egging her on. "You can't just give away land. That land is part of the property. It's family land. Mark is beside himself. We had plans, Mom. Plans for the future, for our family, for Lily." The mention of Lily was a deliberate, poisoned dart, and I felt it land. But it did not have the effect she intended. It did not fill me with guilt. It filled me with a sad certainty. She was using her own daughter as a shield for their greed. "My decision was also for the future, Nora," I said simply. "It was for the town's future, and for the preservation of our family's history." Suddenly, the phone was wrenched away from her. Mark's voice, no longer muffled, blasted into my ear, raw and ugly. "You listen to me, you old woman," he snarled, all pretense of civility gone. "You think you're clever, don't you? Pulling a stunt like this behind our backs? That was our inheritance. That was for us, for your daughter. You have no right to just give away our money." There it was, the truth, stripped of all its pretty justifications. Our money. He had said it. He had already laid claim to my home in his mind, had already spent the profits from its sale. He saw me not as a person, but as a dragon guarding a treasure that rightfully belonged to him. I held the phone slightly away from my ear, letting his rage wash over me without touching me. When he finally paused to take a breath, I spoke, and my voice was as cold and clear as ice. "It is not your money, Mark. It is my property, and it was my right. The matter is settled. The land has been deeded to the town. It is a legally binding and irreversible act." I could hear his sharp intake of breath, the sound of a man who had just run full tilt into a solid brick wall. "Irreversible? What do you mean irreversible? We'll get a lawyer. We will fight this. We will tell them you're incompetent. That you were coerced. By whom? I asked, a genuine, quiet curiosity in my voice. By the Historical Society? By the Conservation Commission? I have a feeling the town council will stand by their newest public benefactor. I have all the documentation, Mark, and I assure you, I am perfectly competent. He was sputtering now, his rage turning to desperate, flailing threats. It was the sound of a bully who had just had his power taken from him. He had no more moves to make, and he knew it. He had been completely and totally outplayed. Nora came back on the line, her voice now pleading, the manipulative tears flowing freely. Mom, please, just undo it. Call them and tell them you made a mistake. We can fix this. Please don't do this to me. Don't do this to us. The us hung in the air between us. For years I had done everything for that us. I had bitten my tongue. I had opened my wallet. I had absorbed the disrespect, all to preserve what I thought was our family. I saw now that I had been the only one fighting for it. There is nothing to fix, Nora, I said, and my voice was gentle, but also absolutely final. And there is nothing more to discuss over the phone. I hung up while Mark was still shouting in the background. The silence that rushed back in was a profound relief. My hand did not even tremble. I looked at my reflection in the dark glass of the window. I saw an old woman, yes, but her eyes were clear and her spine was straight. A few minutes later, my phone buzzed with a text from Nora. We are coming over. We need to talk about this. Good, I thought. Some things are better said face to face. I walked into the kitchen and put the kettle on to boil. I was ready for them. The doorbell rang less than 20 minutes later. The sound was sharp, impatient. I walked to the door, my teacup in hand, and looked through the peephole. It was them. Nora's face was blotchy and tear-stained. Mark's was a tight, furious mask of red. I took a calm sip of my tea, then unlocked the deadbolt and opened the door. Hello, I said, my voice pleasant. I was just having some tea. Would you like a cup? The sheer normality of my greeting threw them off. They had come armed for a battle, ready for screams and accusations. They were not prepared for calm hospitality. They stood on my porch, speechless for a moment, their rage looking clumsy and out of place. We're not here for tea, Mom, Nora finally said, her voice thick with emotion as she pushed past me into the entryway. Mark followed, his presence seeming to suck the warmth out of the hall. That's fine, I said, closing the door gently behind them. But I'm having one. Please, come into the living room. I led them to the very room where my public humiliation had taken place. I gestured for them to sit on the sofa, while I took my usual seat in Robert's armchair. My armchair. They sat stiffly, looking like unwelcome strangers in a house they had, until recently, considered their own. I watched them as I took another slow sip of tea. I would not allow them to set the tone. This confrontation would happen on my terms, in my time. As expected, Mark was the first to break. He could not stand the silence, the lack of control. He shot up from the sofa, pacing in front of the fireplace. I cannot believe you did this, he started, his voice a low growl. After everything we have done for you, the visits, the holidays, all of it. Do you have any idea of the financial damage you have caused? That land was worth a fortune. A fortune. And you just gave it away like it was nothing. Nora began to cry, the soft, pleading sobs that had always worked on me in the past. She's right, Mom. It was our future. For Lily. How could you be so selfish? How could you betray your own family like this? I'm your daughter. Don't I matter more to you than some historical society? I listened. I let them pour all of their poison into the quiet air of my home. Mark ranted about lawyers and property values, about his brilliant plans that I had single-handedly ruined. Nora wept about family and trust and a daughter's broken heart. They paced and they pleaded, they accused and they demanded. And through it all, I said nothing. I simply sat, and I listened. It was a remarkable thing. For years their words had been arrows that found their mark every single time. Now, they were just noise. I was not hearing their arguments, I was seeing their souls. And I saw nothing but an endless, gnawing hunger. There was no love in their words, no genuine concern for me or my well-being. There was only the sound of two people wailing over a wallet they had mistakenly believed was theirs. Finally, their energy began to fade. Mark's pacing slowed. Nora's sobs subsided into sniffles. They had thrown every weapon they had at me, and I was still sitting there, unharmed, calmly drinking my tea. A tense, exhausted silence fell over the room. They were looking at me, waiting for me to break, to yell, to cry, to do something they could understand. I carefully placed my teacup and saucer on the end table beside me. I looked at Mark, then at Nora, and I spoke. My voice was not loud, but it filled the room completely. "This house," I said, my words slow and deliberate, "and the land it sits on was never yours to sell, Mark. It was never your inheritance to plan for." I then turned my gaze to my daughter. "On Christmas Day, in this very room, you sat and watched while your husband told our friends and neighbors that nobody cares about me. You watched him dismiss me like I was a piece of old furniture. You said nothing. I let that sink in before I delivered the final, simple truth. So I made a decision. I decided to give a piece of this property to people who would not see it as a corner to be ignored, but as a space to be cherished. The town of Maple Creek will appreciate that land for the next 100 years." As I finished speaking, I reached into a manila folder I had placed on the table earlier. I pulled out a single sheet of paper and slid it across the coffee table towards them. It was a copy of the deed of donation, officially stamped, recorded, and bearing my clear, firm signature. The physical proof, the final word. Watching them stare at that paper, finally understanding that the game was truly over, I felt a deep sense of relief. It is amazing what a person can accomplish when they refuse to play by someone else's rules. I am curious to know, what is a piece of wisdom you have learned in your life that has given you strength? Please share it in the comments below. Let's fill this space with our collective wisdom and inspire each other. They stared at the document. Mark's face went from red to a pale, sickly white. Nora just shook her head slowly, a look of genuine, dawning horror on her face. They had no more arguments, no more threats, no more tears. They were defeated. The power in the room had shifted, completely and permanently. I stood, up from my chair, the quiet authority in the movement making them both flinch. "I believe this conversation is over," I said, my voice leaving no room for debate. "You know where the door is. It's time for you to leave my house now." They left without another word. I watched from the window as they got into their car, two stiff, silent figures in the deepening twilight. There was no final, shouted insult from Mark, no last, pleading look from Nora. There was only the quiet crunch of their tires. On the snowy driveway as they retreated from a battle they had not even realized they were losing until it was already over. When their taillights vanished around the corner, I drew the curtains, and the silence they left behind was not empty. It was peaceful. I had not won a fight. I had simply ended one. The weeks that followed were quiet. I did not hear from them, and I did not reach out. I spent my days in a state of calm purpose, rediscovering the simple rhythms of my own life, untangled from their constant needs and expectations. The house felt lighter, as if it could finally breathe again. I could breathe again. The true consequences of their actions, and of my response, began to unfold about a month later, not with a bang, but with the rustle of the local newspaper landing on my porch. There, on the front page of the Maple Creek Chronicle, was a large, flattering photograph of me, standing at the edge of my backyard. The headline read, "Local Woman Honors Husband's Legacy, Donates Land for New Public Heritage Trail." The article was everything Mark and Nora would have hated. It painted me as a civic-minded benefactor, a keeper of the town's history. It quoted Eleanor Gable from the Historical Society, who praised my uncommon generosity and sharp historical mind. It quoted Ben Davies from the Conservation Commission, who spoke of the trail as a priceless gift to future generations. The article mentioned my late husband Robert's military service and my own long career as county registrar. It framed my donation as the culmination of a lifetime of service to the community. And, as is standard in such articles, it mentioned the trail's location. It ran along the northern edge of my property on Elm Street, directly adjacent to the home of my daughter and son-in-law, Mr. and Mrs. Mark Peterson. In a small town like Maple Creek, a story like that is more potent than any lawsuit. I did not need to say a word against them. The story did all the work. I heard whispers when I went to the grocery store. Old friends would stop me to congratulate me, their eyes holding a new level of respect. They had all seen Mark's arrogance around town, had all sensed the dynamic. Now the picture was complete. They saw me not as a feeble old woman being managed by her family, but as a pillar of the community who had done something wonderful. And by extension, Mark and Nora were cast as the ungrateful children who had stood by while their mother gave away a piece of their inheritance. The shame was quiet, but I knew it would be pervasive. The financial consequences for Mark were just as severe and just as silent. With a permanent public right-of-way running through it, the property was no longer a developer's dream. It could never be subdivided. No duplex could be built. His imaginary gold mine had been instantly and irreversibly transformed back into what it had always been: a simple, single-family home. A wonderful place to live, but a terrible investment for a man with his ambitions. He had lost his prize. The most painful consequence, however, came in the form of a phone call about 2 months after that day in my living room. It was Nora. Her voice was quiet, subdued, stripped of all its previous anger and tears. "Hi, Mom," she said. "I was just wondering, do you still have Grandma's recipe for popovers? The one she wrote on the index card." It was such a small, mundane question. A question from a different lifetime, when she could call me for anything, when the line between us was easy and open. It was her attempt to build a tiny bridge back to that time, to pretend that the chasm between us did not exist. And I felt a pang of the old maternal instinct, the urge to soften, to make it all okay. But I knew that bridge was an illusion. Some things, once broken, cannot be perfectly mended. "Yes, I have it," I said, my voice polite, but not warm. "It's in the green recipe box in the pantry. I can mail you a copy if you'd like." "Oh," she said, a little surprised by my formal tone. "Okay, yes, that would be nice. Thank you." There was a long, awkward pause. I did not fill it. I did not ask about her life, or Mark, or Lily. That door was now closed. The price of admission to my life was respect, and she had shown me she was no longer willing to pay it. That was the last time I heard from Nora for a long while. Their world had become smaller, quieter, tangled in the consequences of their own choices. My world, however, was just beginning to open up again. The first signs of spring were melting the snow, the trail was nearly ready for its official opening, and for the first time in years, I felt a sense of profound and quiet hope for the days to come. Spring arrived in Maple Creek that year, not as a quiet promise, but as a vibrant, joyful declaration. The snow melted away, revealing the rich, dark earth beneath. The old maple trees that lined my street burst forth with a brilliant, almost defiant, green. And in my own backyard, a new and beautiful life was taking root. The Vance Family Heritage Trail was officially opened on a sunny Saturday in May. There was a small ceremony with the mayor and a lovely article in the paper. But the real celebration for me happens every day. It is the sound of children's laughter as they chase each other down the path. It is the sight of my neighbors, the Potters, taking their evening stroll, hand in hand. It is the quiet greetings from strangers who now see my home not as a private fortress, but as the beginning of a shared journey into the woods. My house is no longer silent. It is filled with the gentle, happy murmur of the community I had forgotten I was a part of. I am sitting now on the new bench we placed at the trailhead, a simple, sturdy piece of oak with a small brass plaque. It reads, "In loving memory of Robert Vance. He loved this town." From here, I can see both the path and my garden, where the tulips are a riot of red and yellow. A small hand slips into mine. It is Lily's. Nora has been dropping her off for a few hours every Saturday. We do not speak of what happened at Christmas. We do not speak of Mark. Nora is polite, her eyes full of a sad, unspoken distance. But she brings me my granddaughter, and for that I am grateful. It is a fragile truce, but it is a start, and it happens entirely on my terms. Grandma, Lily says, pointing with her little trowel, do you think the blue flowers should go next to the yellow ones? I think that's a wonderful idea, my sweet girl, I say, smiling. You have a good eye for color. She beams with pride and gets back to her important work of digging in the dirt, planting a new border of forget-me-nots along the path. I watch her, my heart full. The pain of my daughter's betrayal may never fade completely, but the love I have for this child is a powerful balm. It is a reminder that some bonds are stronger than greed, and that new life can always grow, even in the scorched earth of a painful past. I look back at the events of that winter, and it feels like watching a story about someone else. The shame I felt, the sense of being invisible, it is gone. I am not the woman in the corner anymore. In fighting to save my home, I ended up saving myself. I have reconnected with old friends. I have joined the board of the Historical Society. My days are full, not with obligations, but with choices. My peace is my greatest and most precious wealth, a treasure I earned with every quiet, determined step I took. And as I share the end of my story, I want to thank you for being here with me, for listening. Today, my strength is a gift I give myself every morning. Every subscription to this channel is a vote of support for other women and men who are struggling to find their own voice. Please, help this community of strength grow even louder so that no one ever has to feel like they are alone in their corner. My victory was not loud. It was not a fiery explosion of revenge. It was the quiet, unshakable act of remembering my own worth. It was the realization that I did not need to shout to be heard. I just needed to act on my own truth, using the skills and the knowledge I had cultivated over a lifetime. Mark and Nora had underestimated me, but their biggest mistake was that they had forgotten who I was, and in the end, I had to remind myself too. Lily runs over and gives me a muddy hug, her face bright with accomplishment. I hold her, close, breathing in the scent of sunshine and fresh earth. I look out at the trail, at the life and beauty that now flourishes where a greedy man saw only an empty space to be exploited. And I want to leave you with this one final thought. It is never, ever too late to demand respect. And never forget that true love, real love, does not use you. It values you.